Ashley stood at the bathroom sink, clutching a pregnancy test in her trembling hands. Her gaze was fixed on a single point, unblinking. I leaned against the doorframe, at a loss for words. Her shoulders were tense, and her face carried a mixture of exhaustion and disappointment. "Andy, I can't do this anymore," she exhaled, throwing the test onto the counter. "Why is this happening to us? What are we doing wrong?" I took a step closer but hesitated, sensing she needed space. "Ashley, it's not your fault. These things just happen." I tried to reassure her, though my words sounded dry, almost hollow. "Happen?" she shot back, turning toward me sharply. Her eyes glistened with tears. "Do you know how many times I've heard that? Every test, every cycle, and still nothing." I stepped forward and took her hands, even as she tried to pull away. "Listen, we'll get through this," I said softly, doing my best to stay composed. "This isn't the end, Ashley. We'll find another way. There are doctors. Options? Options? Andy, I'm exhausted. I'm tired of doctors, procedures, and this hope that shatters every single time." Her voice broke, and she turned away. "Ashley," I placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling her tremble as she fought back sobs. "We're in this together. You and me. We'll get through it, even if it takes moving heaven and earth." She was silent for several seconds before exhaling sharply, as though releasing all the pain and despair she'd carried for months. "I just want this to be over, Andy. I want us to succeed." "And we will," I said firmly, though deep down, I feared that day might never come. For over 6 months, we had been trying, and every month brought only disappointment. At first, we joked about it. "Guess we just need more practice," I'd say, making her smile. But with every failure, the jokes grew more strained until they disappeared entirely. Ashley was struggling. There was no denying that. I'd hear her crying in the bathroom late at night, trying to mask the sound with running water. I'd see the guilt in her eyes when she'd turn away, muttering, "Maybe something's wrong with me." I wanted to shout that she wasn't to blame, but the words felt empty. I knew she felt broken, and it was killing me. That's when I made a decision, not for myself, but for her. I decided to do what I should have done long ago. That same day, after work, I went to a clinic. I was healthy, an athlete who had never had any major issues. Why would I need testing? But I knew I couldn't ignore the possibility if we wanted to move forward. It took days to muster the courage to visit the lab, provide samples, and listen to the doctor's instructions. The process was humiliating and surreal. Me, Andy, the guy who solved problems on the treadmill or in the weight room, now standing before a doctor, avoiding eye contact. A week later, when the results came in, I already knew the phone call wouldn't bring good news. "Andy, I have some difficult news," the doctor began, his tone calm but direct. "Your results show that your ability to conceive is practically zero. It's a complex condition, but there are treatment options." Practically zero. Those words echoed in my mind like hammer blows. I thanked the doctor, hung up, and sat in my car in the parking lot, frozen. For the first time in years, I had no idea what to do. How could I tell Ashley? Could she handle such a blow when she was already hanging by a thread? Could I? Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow, I'll find the words. But tomorrow kept slipping away. For an entire month, I carried that secret. Every evening at dinner, I'd search for the right moment to say, "Ashley, we need to talk." But every time, the words stuck in my throat. She seemed so happy talking about new recipes to try or upcoming holidays. I couldn't bring myself to shatter the fragile peace that had finally settled in our home. But the weight inside me grew heavier each day. Ashley noticed my silence, but she didn't press. Or maybe she chose not to. That evening, I decided I couldn't keep it in any longer. Sitting on the couch, I rehearsed the words in my head. Ashley entered the living room with an unusual energy. Her eyes sparkled, and she wore a smile I hadn't seen in months. But there was something else in her expression, an underlying tension, as if she was bracing herself. "Andy," she began, walking toward me. Her voice wavered slightly. "I have something for you." I tensed. My chest tightened as I straightened on the couch. "What is it?" I asked, trying to stay calm. Ashley sat beside me, holding a small white box. She handed it to me, her face filled with anxious anticipation. "Open it," she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a flicker of fear. I took the box, my hands trembling. Inside was a pregnancy test. 2 lines. I stared at it, unable to believe what I was seeing. Ashley, this is, I stammered, my words catching in my throat. She cut me off, grabbing my hands in hers. "Yes, Sandy, we did it. We're going to be parents." Her voice cracked, and tears streamed down her cheeks. I was so scared it would never happen. But look, we made it. I tried to smile, but my mind was racing. Her words echoed, but I couldn't process them. "We did it," I repeated, staring at the test. This is incredible." She hugged me tightly, her warmth enveloping me. But instead of joy, I felt a rising panic. The doctor's words thundered in my head, practically zero. My thoughts spiraled. How was this possible? What had I missed? And what, in God's name, was happening in my family? That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, I began to doubt everything I thought I knew about Ashley. This pregnancy, which should have been our miracle, now felt like something else entirely. I knew there would be questions I had to face, whether I was ready or not. Walking into that clinic for the second time was nothing short of humiliating. When I explained that I wanted to double-check the results, the doctor gave me a look, a mix of professional composure and subtle disbelief. "Andy, I understand your doubts," he began, gesturing for me to take a seat. "But the tests are highly accurate. We can repeat them, of course, but honestly, it's unlikely the outcome will change. Just do it." I cut him off, struggling to mask the storm brewing inside me. That day, I spent far more time at the clinic than I had planned. The wait for the results felt endless. But when they finally arrived, I already knew what they would say. There was no mistake. Andy, someone who had always prided himself on his health, was incapable of becoming a father. Now, the only thing I could think about was, who was the father? Who is he? How long has this been going on? I watched Ashley every evening at dinner, searching her face and gestures for some hidden truth. But she seemed the same, still the caring, slightly tired, sometimes distracted, yet loving wife I had always known. Yet now, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else, something concealed. Or was it just my paranoia? Weeks passed. I didn't know where to begin, and I decided not to act rashly. I needed time to figure things out. Meanwhile, I tried to maintain the appearance of a normal life. We planned the nursery, discussed paint colors, and picked out a crib. I forced myself to smile, agree, and keep the conversations going. The opportunity to uncover the truth came during Ashley's 5th month of pregnancy. She wanted to throw a gender reveal party, inviting neighbors, family, and friends. I didn't want the party. Every time she talked about how fun it would be, something tightened in my chest. But I didn't argue, afraid it might raise suspicion. The party was scheduled for a warm Saturday. We set up tables in the backyard, decorating everything with pink and blue ribbons. Ashley beamed with happiness, circulating among the guests and accepting compliments. I stayed in the background, watching the crowd. And then I saw him. Richard, our neighbor from down the street, who had moved in a little over a year ago. Tall, friendly, always smiling. He stood slightly apart from the main group, but I couldn't ignore how his eyes kept drifting back to Ashley. And then I saw something else, the way she met his gaze. Those fleeting yet charged moments when their eyes locked. The small details began forming a bigger picture. He was next to her in the kitchen when she opened a bottle of champagne for the guests. They laughed at some private joke, whispering to each other. These were little things that most people wouldn't notice, but I was looking for them in her every move now. My heart pounded harder. Memories started resurfacing. How he had shown up on our street to help with the Christmas tree. How Ashley had mentioned trying his culinary experiments, just by chance. How she once said his dog was so fun that they'd gone on walks together while I was out on a run. All these fragments pieced together like a puzzle. I had no solid proof yet, but at that moment, my suspicions became impossible to ignore. The gender reveal party dragged on, but for me, it felt like torture. When Ashley cut into the cake to reveal pink layers, the The crowd erupted in cheers. "It's a girl." I clapped, smiling on the outside, but inside, I felt completely hollow. My daughter. But whose daughter was she, really? After the party, I felt as if I were in the middle of an earthquake. Everything around me had crumbled, yet on the surface, nothing seemed out of place. Ashley and I went about our usual routines, planning the nursery, buying baby clothes, having dinner as always. But now I noticed things I wouldn't have before. When Ashley talked about her day, I picked up on inconsistencies. Like when she said she stayed late at a cafe with friends, even though she had never spent much time with them before. Or how she checked her phone every evening, thinking I didn't notice the way she avoided my gaze when a message popped up. Weeks after the party, I finally made a decision. While Ashley was in the shower, I grabbed her laptop from the living room drawer and powered it on. The password was still the same, our anniversary date. That made me chuckle bitterly. It didn't take long to find the email I remembered her mentioning in passing. Work account. When I opened it, a flood of betrayal spilled out onto the screen. Messages with Richard. Their plans. Their dreams of a future in which I didn't exist. "Richard, I need to wait until the baby is born. Then I'll file for divorce. It'll be easier with the baby here. I'll be able to claim my half. Ashley, you're incredible. I'll wait as long as it takes. As long as you're happy." He doesn't suspect a thing. Sometimes I feel guilty, but this is for our future. I closed the laptop and stared into the void. My heart pounded so loudly it drowned out everything else. Each word I'd read felt like a knife to the chest. They thought they had it all figured out, that I was too blind to notice, too naive to understand. The days that followed were a blur. I went through the motions of life, but now I saw everything through a different lens. Their glances at the party, her fleeting smiles when he was near, even the way she talked about him, with a lightness I hadn't recognized before. Every time I looked at Ashley, I saw a stranger. She kept talking about the baby, about how excited she was to have a girl. I nodded, keeping up the facade, but inside, I was unraveling. I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I thought about the baby, about how she wasn't mine. But they didn't know that I knew. They thought their secret was safe. And I decided that's how it would stay, for now. I couldn't destroy everything at this moment. If I lashed out, if I yelled, if I created a scene, they would find a way out. Excuses, justifications. I needed to wait for the right time. Wait until the baby was born. Then, everything would end. And so, I lived with that thought. Every day, every hour, I prepared for the moment when their lies would unravel. In that waiting, I became someone else entirely. Ashley groaned, gripping my arm tighter than she ever had before. Her face was flushed, and her damp hair clung to her sweat-soaked forehead. Andy, it's happening," she said, her voice breaking with a mix of pain and fear. "We have to go now." I grabbed the hospital bag we had packed weeks earlier and helped her to her feet. Her breathing was erratic, almost panicked, but I kept my composure. Or at least pretended to. "It's going to be okay, Ashley," I said, keeping my tone steady even though a storm raged inside me. "I'll get you there. Just hold on." During the drive to the hospital, she sat beside me, inhaling and exhaling deeply, occasionally clutching my hand so tightly that my fingers went numb. "Andy, say something," she pleaded suddenly, her voice trembling. "I'm scared." I glanced at her for a second before focusing back on the road. "You're strong, Ashley. You can do this," I said, and for once, the words came out sincerely. Because it was true. Strong, but not the person I thought she was. "Thank you," she exhaled, leaning her head back. "You've always been there for me. I don't know what I'd do without you." Her words cut deep, like a blade. If only she knew that I was no longer the Andy she believed I was. But I stayed silent, clenching my jaw as I steered the car toward the hospital. When we arrived, I helped her out of the car. The nurses met us at the entrance, placing her in a wheelchair. She turned to me, her eyes glistening with tears. "You'll stay with me, right? You won't leave me?" she asked, gripping my hand tightly. I froze for a moment before forcing a smile, the kind I'd mastered over the past few months. "Of course," I said. leaning down to kiss her forehead. I'm going to call your parents. Everything's going to be fine. As they wheeled her away to the delivery room, I was left alone in the hospital corridor, but only for a moment. It was time to act. First, I called her parents. They were anxious, but relieved to hear she had made it to the hospital. Then I dialed the next number, the one I had memorized over the past few months, even though I had never called it before. Richard. He answered on the second ring. Andy? His voice was tinged with surprise and a faint trace of tension. Richard, it's Andy. Ashley's in labor. She's at the hospital. I thought you'd want to know. There was silence on the other end. I could almost hear him scrambling to figure out what to say. Of course. Thank you for letting me know, he finally replied, his voice unsteady. I'll be there. Good, I said curtly, hanging up before he could say anything else. Returning to the hospital, I retrieved a folder I had prepared in advance. Inside was a single document, the results of my fertility tests. The paper clearly stated, in black and white, fertility, extremely low, nearly zero. I placed the folder on the bedside table in Ashley's room. She'd see it when everything was over. As I walked back to the car, I felt an odd sense of relief. This was the first step in my plan. Let them think they're in control. Let them enjoy that feeling. Soon, their world would be turned upside down, just as mine had been. Sitting in the car, I started the engine and cast one last glance at the hospital. I knew I was leaving behind an entire world of lies, but I felt no regret. This wasn't my family, and this child wasn't mine. My phone buzzed with a message from Ashley. Where are you? I thought you'd be here with me. I stared at the screen and smirked. With you, Ashley? Not anymore, I muttered under my breath as I pulled onto the road. At home, I collapsed onto the couch in the living room, staring at the photos on the walls. They felt like props from a life that wasn't mine anymore. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because of doubts, but because I was meticulously planning every detail of the confrontation that would finally expose the truth. The next morning, a loud knock at the door woke me. Opening it, I found Ashley's parents standing on the porch. Her mother's face was stained with tears, her father's expression a mix of confusion and anger. Andy, what on earth does this mean? Her mother cried, waving the folder with the test results. Don't you understand she just gave birth? How could you leave her like that? We thought you were better than this, her father added quietly, his eyes full of disappointment. But this is too much. I stood there, silent, letting them vent. When they paused, waiting for an explanation, I finally spoke, keeping my voice calm. It means exactly what's written in that document, I said firmly, meeting their eyes. I'm infertile. The baby isn't mine, and you know it. She knows it. Her mother gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Her father tensed, stepping closer as if preparing to confront me. Are you serious? He growled, his voice low with anger. You brought this to the hospital when she was at her most vulnerable? What are you trying to do? I crossed my arms, standing my ground. I want the truth. She used me. She lied to me. For 6 months, I've watched and waited. Now, she has to face the consequences. Her mother broke into sobs, and her father, at a loss for words, grabbed her shoulder and turned toward the door. We'll be back when you've calmed down, he said over his shoulder. But you'll regret this. I closed the door, keeping my composure, though the weight of it all pressed down on me. I'd had time to prepare, but facing their emotions was harder than I expected. Later that day, my phone rang. It was Ashley. I hesitated but answered. Her panicked voice immediately filled the line. Andy, what does this mean? I saw the documents. Are you saying the baby isn't yours? Are you serious? You know exactly what it means, I said coldly, cutting her off. Or are you going to deny the obvious? The obvious? Her voice quivered with anger and desperation. You're destroying our family, just as I'm giving birth to our child. You're insane. I smirked, staring out the window. Our child, I said, my tone icy. Let's not pretend you believe that yourself. I know everything, Ashley, and you know what I'm talking about. Silence filled the line. I could hear her ragged breathing as she struggled to respond. It's not what you think, she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Oh, really? I interrupted, my voice colder than ever. Are you going to say I misunderstood your messages with Richard? That he isn't the father? Or that you weren't planning to file for divorce and take half of everything? Andy, her voice broke into a sob. Enough, I said, my tone steady and firm. You know the truth. And now, so does everyone else. I'm done playing this game. The baby is your responsibility. And Richard's. How can you say that? She cried, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. You loved me. We built a family. I loved the person you pretended to be, I replied, my voice calm and final. But that person doesn't exist anymore. I ended the call before she could respond. She tried calling again, but I silenced my phone. I knew there would be more shouting, accusations, and tears in the days to come. But I was ready. I'd waited 6 months for this. And now, it was finally over. A week had passed since I left the folder in Ashley's hospital room. It had been the most nerve-wracking week of my life. My phone buzzed constantly. Calls from Ashley, her parents, even her friends, all demanding to know what was going on. Ignoring them would have been a sign of weakness, so I answered, always with cold resolve. During that time, I found unexpected support from my own parents. At first, I hesitated to tell them everything, but when I finally explained the situation, they stood firmly by my side. Andy, my mother said, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder, you did the right thing. It's painful, it's terrifying, but you'll get through this. We're here for you. My father said little, but his firm handshake and silent nod spoke volumes. I began preparing for the next step, filing for divorce. Months of preparation had not been in vain. I had gathered everything, proof of my infertility, copies of their emails, financial records showing suspicious transfers to Ashley's accounts. I found a lawyer I could trust, and together, we crafted a case. But I wanted to file on my terms, ensuring Ashley and Richard couldn't use the child as leverage against me. One evening, Ashley called. I couldn't avoid this one. I knew she wouldn't stop until I picked up. Andy, she started, her tone unusually calm but with an undercurrent of tension. We need to talk. In person. Fine, I replied. Tomorrow evening. At the house. The next day, when she arrived, the atmosphere in the room was electric. Ashley looked exhausted, but her eyes burned with a mix of anger and desperation. Andy, she began, her voice rising to a near shout. How could you? You left me in the hospital. You humiliated me in front of my parents. You've destroyed our family. I stood firm, arms crossed, watching her with a calmness that only seemed to enrage her further. I destroyed our family? I repeated, raising an eyebrow. You're really going to say that? You, who lied to me for months. You, who planned to divorce me and leave me with nothing. That's not true, she screamed, but there was no conviction in her voice. You've misunderstood everything. I smirked, sensing her unraveling. Misunderstood? Ashley, I have proof. Your emails, your plans with Richard. Should I add a DNA test to the list? Do you want to embarrass yourself even more? Her face turned pale, and she stepped back as if my words had physically struck her. You're just trying to hurt me, she cried. This is your way of punishing me. No, I replied calmly. This is my way of protecting myself. You made your choices, Ashley. I'm just finishing what you started. The next day, I filed for divorce. My terms were crystal clear. 1. Ashley would not receive a single cent of my assets. 2. Full custody of the child would remain with her, as the child was not mine. 3. Any attempt by Ashley or her lawyer to seek financial support would be countered with proof of her deception. When Ashley learned of my terms, her fury reached its peak. She called me incessantly, shouting threats about lawyers and scandals, but I was prepared. During one of her tirades, I calmly responded, Ashley, you made your choices. I'm making mine. If you want to go to court, go ahead. I have enough evidence to show everyone who you really are. Her voice wavered, and for the first time, I heard fear creeping in. You can't do this, Andy. I already have, I said, ending the call. The legal battle lasted several months, but I was ready for the long haul. My lawyer, experienced and confident, made it clear. Under no circumstances should I acknowledge the child as mine. That was the key. If I signed even a single document claiming paternity, all my evidence would become meaningless. A DNA test wouldn't matter anymore. At every hearing, Ashley tried to play the emotional card. Her lawyer painted me as a heartless traitor who abandoned his family during a time of need. They presented photos of happy moments from our life together, trying to depict me as a cold, unfeeling villain. But I remained calm. My trump card was the truth. My lawyer presented the court with my medical records proving infertility, copies of Ashley and Richard's emails detailing their plans, and evidence of her intent to manipulate our assets. When all of this was laid out before the judge, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Ashley sat pale and trembling, clutching her hands. Richard, who had attended several hearings, looked like he wanted to disappear. The turning point came when the judge asked if I was willing to take a DNA test to establish paternity. My lawyer immediately responded, "My client refuses the test, as he knows he is not the biological father. The evidence of his infertility, supported by medical records, has been submitted to the court." Ashley shot to her feet. "That's a lie," she screamed. "You're just trying to get rid of us. You want us to suffer." The judge raised a hand, signaling her to sit down. "If you're confident in your claim," the judge said, addressing her, "why haven't you initiated a DNA test yourself?" Ashley froze, lowering her gaze. Her lawyer whispered urgently in her ear, but she had no answer. It was over. The court's decision was clear. The divorce was granted on my terms. Ashley was stripped of any claim to my assets. The court ruled that I was not the biological father, and therefore, I had no obligations to the child. As the decision was read aloud, I felt something strange. It wasn't joy, more like relief. The weight I had carried for 6 months was finally lifted. Ashley fled the courtroom without saying a word. A few weeks later, I heard that Ashley had moved in with Richard. As I expected, he was far from thrilled. It didn't take long for the reality of their situation to sink in. Friends told me their relationship quickly soured, with constant arguments. Richard wasn't prepared for the responsibility of raising a child under such circumstances. Eventually, a few months after moving in, he kicked her out, declaring he couldn't handle it. Ashley was left alone, holding a baby in her arms. I didn't feel schadenfreude, only emptiness. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. I rebuilt my life piece by piece. My parents, who had supported me through everything, helped me move forward. They never brought up the past unless I wanted to talk about it. I threw myself into work, fitness, and planning for a future that, for the first time in months, felt like my own. Occasionally, when I passed families with children, I felt a pang of bitterness. Not for losing Ashley, she was a stranger to me now, but for the dream of a family that had been destroyed. Still, I knew that someday, I'd have the chance to start over, with someone who truly deserved it.